Hi, my name is Peyton Paul, and today I'll be discussing Richard Lee's article, Eating Christmas in Kalahari, which was published in the Natural History magazine in 1969. Lee was an anthropologist who spent years of his life living with the Kung Bushmen people of the Kalahari Desert, and he studied their hunting and gathering lifestyles, and his article he published has become one of the most famous ethnographic stories because it illustrates how a worldview and cultural perception can dramatically shape the way people interpret actions and communication. To begin, the article really centers around Lee's attempts to show generosity during Christmas time to the Bushman people. He had spent much of his time in Kalahari refusing to share his canned food rations and only really shared tobacco and other things, believing that by sharing his canned food rations it would interfere with his study on their hunting practices. So by not sharing his canned food rations, he wanted to make up for that during Christmas time. This is when he decided that he was going to buy the largest ox that he could find to feed the entire community and allow them to feast on. To Lee, the ox that he decided on looked enormous, and he even did calculations in his head about how much meat would be left after the bones and viscera were removed and how much pounds per person someone would get, because the Bushman people get really feisty about meat distribution. He also imagined that his gift would be seen as quite impressive and generous and meaningful because that's how it would be perceived in Western culture. However, when the Bushmen saw the ox that Lee had given when he was going around town telling everybody about it, their reaction completely surprised him. Instead of thanking him or showing any sort of excitement towards the huge ox that Lee had purchased, they laughed and teased him and mocked him for the ox that he chose. They said the ox was scrawny, had no fat, was too old, and would barely provide enough meat for the group. Lee was extremely embarrassed and felt like his attempt to give back to the community that he was studying had completely failed. Yet, when the ox was finally slaughtered after 10 long days of them teasing Lee back and forth, he realized that the ox was actually full of the white fat that the Bushman people loved, and also enough meat to give everybody some and more. This is when Lee realized and also decided that he needed to ask more questions, and he also needed to look through different cultural frameworks to actually genuinely understand the situation. Lee realized that their teasing had nothing to do with the quality of the ox or how much meat it was going to provide. Rather, it was a cultural practice designed by the Bushman people to keep people humble and discourage bragging and prevent anyone from feeling superior to one another because of what they gave, in this case, the large ox. In other words, the Bushmen's humor and teasing acted as a social check for Lee to maintain equality within the group. And this really leads to the first major point of the article and the overall arching theme. And this is really how the worldview of Lee and the Bushman people impacted the interpretation of the cultural meaning of conversations the Bushman people were having with Lee. From Lee's Western perspective, giving the biggest ox should have been met with gratitude because from his Western cultural framework, gift giving is often tied to prestige and admiration and public praise. But from the Bushman's perspective, the very act of boasting about generosity was the problem. Their worldview placed greater value on being humble and celebrating equality rather than celebrating someone's individual generosity like Lee was wanting them to do for him. This really shows the difference between how two cultures and two groups of people can have the same exact event happen to them, but interpreted in completely different ways due to the cultural lens they're looking through. And this really does point out an ethnocentric bias that becomes really clear here. Lee assumed that the largest, heaviest ox would automatically be seen as generous and meaningful. He believed that his Western logic of gift giving was going to transfer over to the Bushmen, when in reality, the extravagance in size had nothing to do with the teasing because his arrogance and bragging and boasting outweighed that. And this is why the Bushman people had to counteract what they perceived as Lee's bragging and downplayed the quality and size. This ethnocentric bias misled Lee to not really understand the meaning behind the Bushman's teasing. He only later really realized it when he sat down and reflected with Tommaso and asked questions that he should have been asking earlier. Lee's worldview will ultimately cause him to misread a deeply common cultural norm within the Bushman people because that's what the Bushman people saw as normal, but Lee thought it was weird, and vice versa. That's why it's so important to practice cultural humility. This story does also challenge the idea that one cultural norms is normal or best, like I had just mentioned. Lee initially thought the Bushman people were being rude and mean to him, when in fact they were just saying, keep your ego out the door. Like, just be humble about it. We appreciate it, but you don't have to go bragging to everybody about it. For the Bushmen, mocking someone's gift is not disrespectful. It is a way for them to protect equality and really ultimately make sure that no one feels superior to one another. And this is very different from how gifts are perceived and large gifts are perceived in Western cultural context, where generosity is, like I said, publicly recognized and praised. What feels normal and admirable in one culture can be seen as dangerous and prideful in another. And this is the main takeaway here, and that it really shows that cultural values are relative to where you are, and assuming that your own cultural values are superior to someone else's really truly prevents understanding of one another. And this is when I'd really like to tie in some points about my own cultural background. A really unique tradition that we have in Irish culture is holding a wake after a funeral, and that's where family and friends will get together and share stories, have food, and celebrate the life of the deceased. And from a person's culture who really looks at deceased and funerals and death in a mournful, sad way, they would see this as disrespectful and inappropriate, and how on earth would laughter and joy and storytelling be fit for a funeral setting? And from the Irish perspective, through celebration and celebrating life, that is an expression of love towards the deceased and respect. And just like in Lee's story, it shows how cultural values really shape cultural perceptions of what is honorable or dishonorable, just like bragging. And this is what brings us to what is the best practice of communicating across cultures and have really strong intercultural communication. I believe the answer is cultural humility. This means setting aside your own beliefs and being unbiased in what you think is normal or not, and instead strive to just understand from their perspective. Looking through someone else's perspective can really shape how we interpret words, actions, and gifts. And what looked like rudeness to Lee was actually the Bushman's way of keeping his pride in check. If he had looked at it from their perspective, he wouldn't have been hurt or offended by this behavior. By practicing cultural humility, we can avoid misjudging others and allow ourselves to just adjust to someone else's approach to things and just really understand. I have also experienced cultural misunderstandings similar to Lee experienced. When I visited the Japanese countryside with my family, I was asked to cover my tattoos because in rural Japan, they're seen as being violent or being associated with organized crime, and it just considered offensive. At first, I felt really judged because I'd only been to Osaka and Tokyo where they're widely accepted, but then I realized they have a different perspective on things. They're not from America. They don't know. And I felt like this was very similar to Lee's experience with the ox. He believed the gift would be generous and respected, but the Bushman cultural values interpreted it differently. These experiences show how important it is to recognize that perception is always viewed through a different worldview than your own. Overall, I think the most significant lesson I gained from Richard Lee's Eating Christmas in Kalahari is that worldview and perception shape every part of intercultural communication. Lee's story demonstrates how easy it is to misinterpret another culture because we assume our way of thinking is a normal one. For me, the takeaway is that true understanding comes from humility, listening, observing, and being willing to see different cultures through someone else's perspective. Only then is when we can ultimately communicate across cultures with respect, clarity, and understanding. Thank you so much.